substance equals spin. The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words are now, it's made with good intentions.
Hello everybody, welcome to 1 of 200, the New Zealand and International Politics podcast. Today we will be talking about US foreign policy and asking some questions. Questions like, what is the basis of US foreign policy? Is it human rights? And what is the cost of a foreign policy that is not based in human rights? Questions that are important, I think, for both Americans and non-Americans to ask. And thankfully, we have a great guest on today to talk about this. Our guest today is Dr. Annelle Sheline. She is a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a think tank and news outlet that I'd recommend everyone go to if you want to get a clear-eyed and sensible perspective on what is happening in the world. She also somewhat famously served as a foreign affairs officer at the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor's Office of Near Eastern Affairs before she resigned in March 2024 in protest at the Biden administration's unequivocal support for the Israeli war on Gaza. Dr. Sheline, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with just a really basic question. You wrote a paper very recently about the U.S. pursuit of military primacy for the Quincy Institute, and how it has a distorting effect on U.S. foreign policy, and does not necessarily serve U.S. interests very well. I want to ask you about one of the big claims that you're making there to give us a little more of an idea of what you're thinking on this is. How did arms sales become kind of the tip of the spear for U.S. foreign policy, and what kind of impact has this actually had on the pursuit of that foreign policy on the world stage?
Yeah, so the if I can back up just a little bit, the premise of the paper was to try to take on an assumption that I encountered a lot while at the State Department, which was the notion that the United States has to maintain military primacy in order to advocate for human rights. This notion of the U.S. as a force for good in the world, the alternative being chaos, the alternative being a world order dominated by countries like China or Russia or other countries that, clearly do not care about human rights. And what I argue in the paper is the United States does not care about human rights either. For all that we had in the Biden administration a foreign policy team that liked to talk about human rights, even before October 7th, it was very clear from my experience inside the State Department that human rights were not driving U.S. foreign policy, which isn't all that surprising for anyone who's aware of what U.S. foreign policy has been sort of since essentially, I would argue, World War II, when the United States really started to pursue military primacy as a core aspect of our sort of agenda around the world. But at the same time, there was still this assumption that all in all, the U.S. was a force for human rights and for these sort of ideals. And again, the Biden administration liked to talk about the way it was supporting the liberal international order. In particular, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it liked to talk about this a lot and put a lot of resources into documenting Russia's extensive human rights abuses in Ukraine. And so the hypocrisy was all that much more stark in the aftermath of October 7th, given the atrocities that Israel began committing essentially as soon as that the awful, and I want to recognize the Hamas attack was truly awful, especially in targeting civilians, which is a war crime. But the response from Israel very early on, it became clear that the United States was going to continue to enable these atrocities and that there seemed to be no red lines. And so for your question about arms sales, the United States has been the world's premier arms dealer since 1950, which is a very long time. And in the current context, and especially what I observed under the Biden administration, where great power competition was the underlying motivation for so much of what the Biden team was doing. Clearly, we saw that on display with Russia, or with providing support to Ukraine to counter Russia, but also just in sort of the day-to-day interaction with countries in the Middle East, like I was covering within the Human Rights Office, where the real concern was this competition with China. And so under that framework, the assumption I heard from folks, including at the National Security Council, was this idea that weapons sales are the only place where the United States can still compete, because economically, the US cannot really compete with China. On other fronts, the concern is that the US had lost its edge. And so maintaining the fact that the US is sort of head and shoulders above the next 10 countries, the US spends more on our military than the next 10 countries combined. And a large part of that is the production and sale of weapons, that this is viewed as quite integral to US foreign policy, to maintaining relationships with other countries. And this notion that if the US were to pull back from any of these, whether it's weapons sales to Saudi, which got a lot of attention in the context of the war on Yemen, which is also a horrific humanitarian disaster, or US support for Israel, the counter argument is, well, if we don't sell them weapons, someone else will. And while that's not incorrect, I think the broader question here is, well, do we really want to be the ones enabling these kinds of things? Because at least right now, if the United States had cut off support to Saudi Arabia in the context of the war on Yemen, or if the United States were to cut off support for Israel, their behavior would be quite significantly constrained, and they would have to make different choices. And given the level of dependence both of these countries, as well as somewhere like the UAE and what they're funding in Sudan, these countries would have to change their behavior in the short term. And in the longer run, the United States would no longer be responsible for profiting from the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people.
You mentioned that competition with China drives a lot of this, and I mean it seems to be what drives almost every element of U.S. foreign policy right now. This need to I guess win the 21st century from a rising China, but in that competition, the U.S. also has to a large extent to win the hearts and minds of much of the world, particularly the global South. I'm curious, in pursuing this strategy of military primacy and using arms sales as the fulcrum for which to do that, how is that actually? What has been the real world impact on this attempt to kind of win the future against China and to win over parts of the world that maybe could go either way?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I do think that it, as like this national security official or National Security Council official recognized to me in saying that weapon sales are kind of one of the only places where the U.S. can still outcompete China. I mean, I would have challenged him to say, well, maybe given that the US is no longer, leading the world in economic production, or like these other arenas where the United States used to be more accustomed to being in front, that it is time for the United States to grapple with and hopefully adjust with some measure of grace to a multipolar world order where the US is no longer the sole superpower. Or obviously the US also spent a significant portion of the post-World War II era as one of two major superpowers competing with the Soviet Union. But that now moving forward in this multipolar world order where you do have, as you mentioned, needing to win the hearts and minds of people in the so-called global South, this is where the US theoretically could maintain an advantage, or that the United States could distinguish itself. This is all with a lot of caveats, given everything that is going on, that the way the United States, and as an American, I was accustomed to sort of viewing our country as somewhere, even if we did not abide by these ideals in a manner that I would hope we would, that at least there remains some sort of commitment to notions of fundamental freedoms enjoyed by Americans. and the notion that we were promoting those abroad. And I do think, obviously under the Trump administration, a lot of these assumptions have been turned upside down. And so but I do think it is a question that is useful. To what extent under Trump is this myth of American exceptionalism being stripped away? And it's very hard to pretend to ourselves as Americans, or to continue to pretend to the rest of the world that the United States is in any way engaged in some sort of project that is intended for sort of the benefit of others, or that it is engaging in anything other than sort of naked self-interest. In terms of arms sales and winning the future, there are many, many countries that are working determinedly to expand their own weapons sales at home, their own weapons productions capacities at home. I'm familiar with the case of the Middle East, so I could speak, in greater detail about that. But in particular, this also just speaks to the changing nature of war, that for a long time, the United States had the resources to produce these so-called exquisite sort of planes and these massively expensive things like aircraft carriers. And we saw during the War on Terror how actually that kind of a military wasn't all that effective outside of the context of sort of a standard, military to military conflict. And in the case of dealing with a counterinsurgency, the US military had to really rethink some of the ways it was operating. And moving forward now in the context of very inexpensive drones, other inexpensive small armaments, you think about something like the Houthis being capable of, thus far not being particularly diminished, even in the face of a truly horrifying US bombing campaign that has targeted civilians, and I anticipate will continue to have little effect in actually deterring the Houthis, despite the huge cost of what the United States is dropping on Yemen. This just speaks to the fact that the United States is not going to be able to continue to maintain its sort of pride of place at the top, because it will become cheaper, and as many, many different countries are producing more and more of these kind of easy to manufacture weapons. The fact that the US continues to make kind of the fanciest and most expensive planes, you'll have a lot of countries that maybe will want to keep buying those, because if a country has the wealth to do so, it is kind of a status symbol to have these, something like the F-35, despite the fact that it doesn't work well. However, countries are also going to be investing a lot more in the small, cheap drone, as we've observed in the war in Ukraine, for example. So again, I don't think that the US foreign policy establishment is quite grappling with the reality of what a multipolar world order will mean, especially as right now we hear Trump saying things like he's going to give $1 trillion to the military, building up for a possible confrontation with China. Again, I think Americans just are unfortunately somewhat desensitized to this notion that, like, well, if it's for national security, we just have to keep throwing money at it, and that will keep us safer, when in fact, the reality is often the opposite.
Well, in terms of the U.S. foreign policy establishment grappling with reality, the impact of the war on Gaza and the U.S. support for it, which seems to be unconditional and unlimited at this point, certainly by the end of the Biden administration, that seemed to be the case. What was the cost, I guess, of this support in terms of U.S. relationships with countries in the global South? I'm curious, both based on your research and based on anything you might have seen firsthand when you were working in the State Department, how that policy ended up impacting this.
It was hugely detrimental. It became pretty much impossible to try to advocate for human rights, because any counterpart across the table from, again, I was working on the Middle East, would sort of stare in disbelief if a US official tried to bring up some kind of human rights abuse that the US was saying, you need to lock up fewer journalists, or you can't keep imprisoning members of the judiciary, whatever. And there's, unfortunately, in the Middle East, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring of 2011, we have seen deepening authoritarianism, including in places like Tunisia, which were for a little while, sort of, one of the bright spots of democratic elections that came out of the Arab Spring, which now even that's not happening. And these officials would just kind of look at us like, really, you're going to lecture me on human rights? You're going to lecture my country on what we're doing, given what you're enabling in Gaza? And also, members, human rights defenders or journalists or others who were coming from these countries, who maybe had a fellowship or some sort of means of coming to the United States, our office would engage with them about, how can we support you? What are the ways that, what are the latest challenges you're facing? And they would just want to talk about Gaza. And as a representative of the US government, we can't criticize an existing policy. We can't express our agreement with what they were saying. And there was really very little we could do, because they didn't want to talk about what they were facing. They wanted to talk about the genocide, understandably. So that was part of why I resigned, was just it had become increasingly clear that I was just not able to do the work that I had been hired to do. And, the efforts that I was making on the inside, including co-authoring a dissent cable, and signing some other dissent cables, that was clearly having no effect at all. And so I hope that by speaking out, I might contribute to public pressure on the Biden administration. But as you said, under Trump, things are no better, and if anything, possibly worse, just given the fact that Israel has not allowed in any aid into Gaza since March 2nd, and is continuing to bomb. And, just again, the Biden administration really put almost no limitations on the support they gave to Israel, but there was at least some lip service paid to the idea that maybe there would be conditions. And again, over and over, Israel kept crossing red lines, and it was clear actually there were no red lines. But things like, the Biden administration officials felt very proud of the fact that they did get Israel to allow in aid. And at the time that seemed so minimal, but I think now, in the context of a Trump administration that is clearly not even doing that, it seems more and more apparent that the Trump administration is very much supporting Israel's efforts to force the population of Gaza to leave or die.
Well, speaking of all that, I was struck by this one bit of your paper, which is, given everything that you've just said about Trump, and given, Trump is obviously one of the first things he did was get rid of instruments of US soft power, get rid of US support for human rights. And yet, you write, President Biden's support for human rights of Ukrainians, but not the human rights of Palestinians, did more damage to the overall cause of human rights advocacy than even Trump. And, I'm sure some people hearing that would surprise them. They would say, how can that be? Trump doesn't even pay lip service to human rights. It seems to denigrate the entire thing. At least Biden kind of had this rhetorical commitment to it. So how can that be the case that Biden, even as he was at least paying lip service to this idea and wasn't maybe going as far as Trump is going now, ended up doing more damage to the cause of human rights?
Yeah, I mean, this is I think it is an open question, because, on the one hand, is it worse to completely reject the idea of human rights at all, as Trump is doing? Although it is kind of funny, because occasionally you do see members of his administration that will invoke human rights against an adversary, which is fairly typical, also of the Biden administration. But so, to eschew the lip service and just sort of reject the notion of human rights writ large? Or is it worse to pay lip service and to sort of signal that as long as you use the right rhetoric, or you maintain, some lines on your website, or, you keep doing the human rights reports, but you don't actually implement what they're supposed to do? I mean, the human rights reports, which is a big part of what I worked on, were initially instituted by Congress to determine whether or not a country was eligible to receive American weapons. And yet they have never actually been used for that purpose. And that purpose was never acknowledged while I was at the State Department. They are simply seen as an end in and of themselves for human rights organizations or other civil society groups to have sort of this official record of the State Department recognizing human rights abuses by these other countries. And I would argue that in many ways it is more insidious and more detrimental in the long run to reinforce a pattern that all the United States really means when we talk about human rights is that you need to say the right things. You need to have a pride flag, like these like performative gestures that do not actually influence policy, and that is adequate. And then that also just reinforces what countries like China or Russia, who are invested in sort of tearing down the notion of human rights writ large, or who at least are in no way really interested in trying to build up norms or laws around human rights, that they can say, look, it's all just performative, it's only aimed at their enemies, as opposed to someone like Trump, where I do think it is somewhat easier for those who advocate for human rights or who try to build up, in particular, things like international humanitarian law or just international laws or US laws that are dedicated to upholding human rights, to sort of all unify in opposition to a figure like Trump that clearly rejects these, and to say, no, we affirm their importance. And here's what we need to do to codify them better, to enforce these laws, to otherwise demonstrate that it does matter for all of us. I mean, I think, again, for many people who may not be motivated by what's happening to Palestinians, and who maybe are just sort of desensitized to the degree of depravity that we continue to see on our phones every day coming out of what the IDF is doing in Gaza, these are unprecedented. So like the numbers of attacks on hospitals, on humanitarian workers, on doctors, on universities, on churches and mosques. I mean, they're all protected sites. You think about numbers like, this war, Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza has killed more journalists in this conflict than in any previous conflict, and like since they started keeping records. And all of these protections were put in place after World War II because of the degree of violence that World War II, meted out upon Europe. So in particular, it was European countries and the United States that said never again, never again the Holocaust, never again these kinds of war crimes, and codified these in expanding the Geneva Conventions, in instituting these institutions, including setting up the UN, that the crime of aggression is the paramount crime in the international system. And so when Israel, you hear Netanyahu saying things like, well, we're bombing Germany the way the US bombed Germany, or like the US dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, the world repudiated that. The United States and major European powers came together and said, we should not fight wars like this anymore. We need to uphold norms and laws that prevent this sort of targeting of innocent civilians, and even of militaries, that there are also laws around, like, what are you allowed to do to a military. So, and again, I think so many people don't really understand where that leads us in the future, if it has been demonstrated that Israel is not only capable of carrying out these kinds of atrocities and war crimes with no accountability, but it is shielded from accountability by the country that purports to uphold these kinds of laws and this so-called order. It's just very dark for what the future of war will look like.
Yeah, I mean, that point about, we've heard that so many times, the justification for what's happening in Gaza being based on, well, we did this to the Germans in World War II, so therefore it's fine. And I mean, besides everything you correctly said, one of the ironies about that is that, I remember finding this quote by Nixon in the 70s, and I think a reporter asked him, are you carpet bombing Vietnam, the way that the US did in World War II? And Nixon, who obviously was brutally bombing not just Vietnam, but several other Southeast Asian countries, at least felt the need to publicly deny that. He said, no, that's terrible. Of course, we would never do that. That's sort of the hallmark of a bygone era that hopefully we have left behind. Now, again, of course, he was not being honest there, but the fact that he felt the need to deny that he was doing that he acknowledge that, no, this is so horrible. I cannot be seen to be doing this. And yet now, 50 years later, we have not just Israeli officials, but US officials and European officials using this exact reasoning that Nixon rejected as too barbaric to justify what they're doing. It does speak to some kind of very sad, a rollback in terms of where we are as a society, it seems to me. But there's another line that I found particularly striking in what you wrote, which is you said that the pro-Israel lobby and the defense lobby share an interest in the US maintaining military hegemony in the Middle East. And I observed this directly while working at the State Department. I'm curious, can you give us a little more detail? How did this aspect manifest itself in the day-to-day operations of US foreign policy when you were there? Or if you can give us more of an idea of how these two lobbies would work together to ensure this was the kind of central engine of US foreign policy.
Yeah, it's, the lobbies tend to work more directly in Congress. I mean, that's where, it is possible for a registered lobbyist to go and meet with a member of Congress and to send inordinate amounts of money under Citizens United and, other ways that money has fully corrupted our political system, such that when the policy is being implemented at the State Department, it's not really like there's a lobbyist from APAC, making the rounds. I mean, I guess I shouldn't. It's certainly possible that is also happening there. But for the most part, that sort of relationship is like several steps removed. Whereas I think by the time you're actually like writing a policy memo or, putting together talking points or something at the State Department, this is all very internalized and it's just known what the policy is. And so I remember, for example, working on a document and everything in, it's a huge bureaucracy. You've got multiple people, multiple offices who all have reasons to be involved in sort of the production of a given document. And so I'm working on these text with many other people in the document, and I might say in a comment in the margins, let's rewrite it like this, highlighting Israel's human rights abuses or something. And then someone else would come in and say, well, no, that's not how we talk about that. Or, erase like X through the comment or just something like, and if I had, and I could try and say, well, no, I think this is important. This is happening. This is documented. The State Department has recognized this to a certain extent. And if they push back, then it escalates, goes to both of our bosses. And then it's a question of like, well, are they going to go head to head on this? And certainly perhaps in certain instances, my boss's boss was maybe willing to make the point, the human rights point. But in the end, the policy is the policy. And for the most part, it doesn't need to escalate because people just know, well, if you continue to escalate, like we know what the policy is. And so much of the work at the State Department is just sort of finding new ways to restate an existing policy. So, people have asked me, why wasn't there more resistance inside state? And I do think there really was this perception from many people that the Biden administration believed in the State Department, was this advocate for American goodness around the world, American leadership, in a way that under the first Trump term, he really went head to head with the State Department because he did find a measure of people just sort of resisting internally and slowing things down. And you didn't see that as much under Biden. And so although there are many ways that I am very concerned about what the Trump administration is doing, and in particular on things like human rights, my hope is that, again, kind of like I was saying about, is it worse to parrot the rhetoric or is it worse to remove any sort of even performance of caring about human rights or other such concerns? I think it is easier to galvanize a resistance when the other side, the Trump administration or whomever, is so clearly in opposition. Whereas again, when it can, the insidiousness of an administration that claims to care about these things, that will parrot the talking points, is much more difficult. And, unless someone is really engaged or someone for whom this matters personally, I think many people were kind of willing to just kind of go along with it. Also, power is a hell of a drug. Many people inside the State Department, these are difficult jobs to get, and people feel really that if they weren't doing them, it'd be worse if someone else were to do these jobs. And so, I mean, I would just challenge people now to think about like, okay, well, how did things look under Biden with you doing your job versus how things look under Trump with someone else doing your job? And they don't look all that different.
That was an extremely good point. This brings me to a question I've been wrestling with. I think a lot of people are trying to figure out the answer to, and who knows if we ever will. And I really want to know if you have any special visibility or your own interpretation of this, which is what exactly was going on with the decision making in the Biden administration over Gaza. A lot of it seems, you look at the face of it, and you think this seems completely contrary to the political and the geopolitical interests of the US and the Biden presidency. And yet it was allowed to go on and on and on, despite the fact that it was destroying his own party, despite the fact all the costs that you've already mentioned to US foreign policy. And yet we constantly heard people like yourself, people who are below the Secretary of State being overruled, having their findings ignored or changed, and so on and so forth. So I guess, first of all, what was actually driving the Biden administrations, do you think, their unequivocal support for this war?
Ugh, yeah, a lot of people have asked that because I do think it was so puzzling. I mean, I think racism was a large part of it. I think that Biden's identity as a self-declared Zionist was a significant part of it. I also think that this notion of the bear hug, this idea that the United States would be able to influence Israel more if there was zero daylight between them, if there was no perception that the US was trying to pressure Israel, and instead was giving Israel everything it wanted, and therefore the US would sort of have Israel's trust to the trust of the Netanyahu government. And what's interesting is that early on, it did seem that maybe that had yielded that initial ceasefire in around Thanksgiving of 2023. And it was at that time that I and others within DRL, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, which had been quite vocal in our concerns about this policy, had the opportunity to speak with and meet with Secretary Blinken in a group setting. And I asked him this question, as you framed it, which was essentially this apparently unconditional support for Israel seems to contradict so many other goals the administration has laid out, whether it's competing with China, whether it's human rights, whether it's also competing with Russia, whether it's the question of Ukraine, whether it's climate change, like so many areas that the Biden administration had said it was committed to, some of which maybe were more idealistic and some of which really were about, like something like competing with China, which again, as we have talked about, drove so many other aspects of the administration's decision making. And his answer was long and kind of boiled down to the logic of the bear hug, the idea that the closer we are to Israel, the more we can impact them, the more lives we can save. And again, at that time, his logic seemed borne out by the ceasefire. And yet, once that ceasefire broke down, and then months and months and months went by, and there was no more ceasefire, and again, all these red lines, things like Rafah, things like when, the Biden administration implementing NSM 20 to kind of determine oversight or sort of looking deeper into what exactly Israel was doing, and the determination that Israel, this was what my State Department colleague Stacey Gilbert resigned over, because she and colleagues had been working on that document, which determined that Israel was blocking American humanitarian aid, which would also render them ineligible to receive U.S. security assistance. And instead of publishing those findings, the State Department revoked Stacey and her colleagues' access and published a report that came to the opposite conclusion. And that's why Stacey quit. Just so again, it's sort of like early on, maybe the sort of bear hug mentality seemed to have been more effective. And yet over time, it just became clear that the Netanyahu government had taken away that they could do anything, and the Biden team was not going to rein them in at all. Another interesting thing that I mentioned in the report, which has been reported publicly in The Economist, was that the Israelis didn't anticipate being able to continue. I mean, always throughout history, including the relatively short bombardment of Israel conducted of Gaza in 2021, that lasted a few weeks, and then the Biden White House called and said, all right, this is enough dead babies. It's not looking good politically for us, or whatever they said, that was enough. And so the Israelis were anticipating only being able to engage in this horrific level of violence for a short period. And then Biden, the White House, would call up and say, okay, no more. And yet they never did. And this partly explains why we saw such a lack of a strategy from the Israeli military, which was looking to the Netanyahu government for the strategy, and the government was saying, well, you're the military, you come up with a strategy. And now understanding better that, well, because they didn't think they were going to actually be allowed to continue to do this for so long. And in many ways, this is just the latest and most egregious example of how the United States has so consistently given Israel everything it wants. And often you do hear people saying things like, well, the Palestinians keep rejecting a peace agreement. And then you look at it and it's like, well, no, they're rejecting kind of the loss of their land. And, why would they agree to less than what international law and the UN has determined that they are eligible to receive? And always in the past, or at least frequently in the past, the United States would at least maintain a semblance of being some kind of mediator, even if in the reality the US was just advocating for Israel's interests. Under the Biden administration, you saw that break down too, just not even really parroting concern for Palestinians. So, and I don't have a good answer for, as the months went by and it became clear that the bear hug strategy was not actually protecting civilians and was not getting Israel to change its behavior, why they didn't update their thinking, even to the point of losing the White House over it. The poll out from YouGov and the Institute for Middle East Understanding that found that 29% of voters who had voted for Biden in 2020 and didn't vote for Harris cited Gaza as their reason. And that was above any other issue, including issues that were subsequently thought of as being influential, like inflation or immigration. So that Biden's unwillingness to adopt a new policy, and then Harris's either unwillingness or inability to distance herself from Biden on this, meant that they lost the White House, and potentially this is the end of American democracy. I mean, Trump's already talking about a third term. We see him violating rulings by judges. We see him engaging in it's only been a couple of months, and we already see some pretty extreme assaults on some sort of fundamentals of what were once seen as sort of basic American rights and freedoms. So, I mean, unfortunately, I do really think that moving forward in history, the way that that the Biden administration not only was unwilling to rein in Israel or to follow our own laws, which require the U.S. to cut off security assistance to a country engaging in gross violations of human rights, to a military engaging in these kinds of human rights, to a country not allowing in U.S. security assistance. I mean, this is all just in U.S. law. And yeah, the long-term repercussions of that, I think we don't know yet what they will be.
You mentioned the lack of a strategy from Israel, but that description also strikes me as, at least to me, what I observed from the Biden administration. It seemed like that there wasn't really any overarching grand plan for what they were doing with that war. Even though, people who are detractors of the Biden administration, people I know said, oh, this is all part of this plan. The Biden administration wants to do this and this and this. And yet I found constantly things that they would do seemingly contradicted earlier goals. And I remember that this was reported that at some point, I think in 2024, that the supposed end game of all this was going to be that once they allowed Israel to wear itself out with bombing and they destroyed Hamas, or I guess could claim that they had destroyed Hamas, then at that point, Biden would broker this Saudi normalization deal that would also pave the way for a Palestinian state. They'd rebuild, and then Biden would go on a victory tour through the Middle East and tout his, success and skill as a leader. Obviously, that did not happen. It struck me, as I'm sure it probably struck many people, as quite fantastical at the time. And I guess the question I want to ask is, was there an element of delusion and denial going on here within the Biden administration and the, all the different institutions that supported it on this front that drove things? Because all of that does not strike me as particularly realistic then or now.
Yeah, just trying to explain the continued pursuit of the same, just months and months and months of like, clearly this is not working. And even then when, Mohammed bin Salman increasingly adopted a harder line policy saying, they'll assassinate me if I normalize with Israel. It's going to be Anwar Sadat all over again. And, so obviously there was not going to be this sort of victory tour in the offing. Yeah, I think you're right that they continue to see that as the ultimate goal. And it did just speak to something that became very painfully obvious for people after the debate between Biden and Trump, when everybody suddenly realized what just the dynamics there, and that Biden was so diminished. And I think so many people at that moment were sort of like, what is going on here? Why won't he step down? And then ultimately he did, pressure from various Democratic leaders. But I think that, and I wrote about this at the time, how that sort of dogged unwillingness to accept reality was something that I and others had been witnessing in this sort of insane approach to Israel and Gaza. And now suddenly everybody else could see it too, of Biden's unwillingness to recognize that he was not capable of defeating Trump. So some of this speaks to the dangers of a gerontocracy, where you have just very old people running things that are unwilling to really take feedback or listen to others. We know that Biden had very few people around him that he really sought their counsel or, was willing to listen to. And that there was this effort inside his White House to sort of protect him from too much public scrutiny or, threats to the possibility of him running again, until, again, it just became so obvious that it was undeniable. And then he finally did step down. But again, this sort of like speaks to Biden's arrogance. He saw himself as this foreign policy master who'd been doing this for so long, and, in his time in the Senate. But there were other important people driving that as well inside his White House. Brett McGurk, as someone who came through several different administrations and continually advocated for U.S. support to autocratic governments like the Saudis and the Emiratis and to Israel, seeing that as the path that the United States should continue to follow, not that this is a new path for the U.S., but to really double down on that and sort of as this sort of anti-Iran coalition. Although I don't have a lot of optimism for Trump, I do think that there's something to be said for his willingness, and to a certain extent, the willingness of those around him, to buck certain traditions, to rethink certain assumptions. Even things like meeting with Iran or Iranian officials over the weekend is encouraging. I hope that those talks can lead to some sort of renewed deal. But the Biden officials never met directly with Iranian officials. I don't know that Iranian officials were willing to do that. especially because Biden could have, there were many things that when Biden came into power, he just sort of overturned. Things like, Trump leaving the Paris Accords, Biden just sort of automatically returned, and other um, policies that Biden sort of tried to set the clock back. But on many things, especially having to do with Israel, he didn't change anything, and including the Iran nuclear deal. Like he could have just automatically rejoined that with very little, wouldn't have cost much political capital to do so because he was doing this in so many other arenas. It would have just been seen as one of many decisions to try to overturn damage that Trump had done, or what was seen as damage. And he didn't do that. And instead, we saw him doubling down on things like the Abraham Accords, like you talked about, this ambition to foster Saudi-Israeli normalization and for Biden to go on this victory tour. We know that's something Trump is also interested in. That, over the weekend, there were reports that the U.S. is in talks with Saudi Arabia about a civilian nuclear program, which initially had been tied to the idea that Saudi would need to normalize with Israel, which ostensibly the Saudis would require some kind of concessions on Palestine to do so. And now it seems that, which is something also Biden had talked about, which was to just facilitate an open-ended security agreement with Saudi Arabia. And is, the question of normalizing with Israel wouldn't even be part of that. It would just be its own thing, which I think is quite counter to U.S. interests, because we know if the U.S. helps the Saudis develop nuclear technology, the Emiratis will want the same thing, so will the Qataris, so will many other U.S. partners in the region and around the world, which contravenes America's long-stated non-proliferation policy in trying to sort of prevent the unnecessary growth in nuclear capacities of various countries. So, and so much of this does go back to this sort of flawed belief that the United States has to maintain these relationships with these countries, because if we don't, someone else will, and someone else will profit off that. But it's not like the American people are profiting from this. It's just these massive weapons companies. And instead, what's happening is the US is spending more and more money building up our military as we're faced with the reality of other countries around us gaining in their capacity as well. I mean, this is the security dilemma, that anything a country does to make themselves feel more secure makes other countries feel less secure, and then you get an arms race. So the alternative vision would be for the US to rethink our global role, to no longer be driven by this commitment to weapons sales and military primacy. I mean, this would be a really fundamental rethinking. It was funny, in this paper, I got some notes, and one was like, well, what would be your policy suggestions? Like, what are the recommendations? And it's like, no, this is like a fundamental paradigm shift. Like, you can't really, if the United States actually wants to prioritize human rights, it cannot do so if military primacy remains the overarching driver of our foreign policy. And it's just never going to happen. So I mean, certainly there are recommendations one could make at the margins, but to maybe try and ameliorate some of these questions. But my point in the paper was we can't get there from here. We have to really rethink our entire approach.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, this approach has not been good for the American people. It's good for maybe a select few companies, but I mean, if you think about just the scale of carnage that has been visited on American communities, and the anger that all these military interventions over decades have fostered in places. I mean, Trump's win in 2016 was partly based on the fact that he did better in counties that had a higher degree of military casualties from people who went to
Right.
Iraq and Afghanistan. So
Because
people clearly are not into this.
such a hawk. And
Right, yeah.
and he did the same thing in this election, proclaiming that he would be, no more endless wars, the candidate of peace.
Yeah.
And successfully portraying Harris as, being more aggressive or more hawkish.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible how Trump's opponents seem to not really learn from anything that has happened in the past, or even just, their previous experience with him a few years back. But there you go. Well, I think that's about as good a place to end it. I really want to thank you for coming on. It's an interesting paper. We didn't cover nearly most of the things that you wrote about in it. I would suggest to everyone to go read it. We'll put the link in the episode when it goes up. I think everyone should follow you on Twitter, and generally, like I said, go to the Quincy Institute to try and get a bit of a refresher, and reset your thinking about U.S. foreign policy and the things that are happening in the world, because Quincy is really a pretty unique voice in terms of putting I would say a sane, realistic perspective on what's happening in the world. But yeah, is there anything else you want to promote before we finish up?
No, just thanks so much for those kind words. I'm on Twitter at Annelle Sheline, and yes, the paper is available on the Quincy website. And appreciate all of your work and also trying to push back against some of these assumptions.
Well, I appreciate that.
Need for fresh thinking.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that will win out. We're playing the long game here, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, thanks again.
Thank you.
If artificers are denied, living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now is paved with good intentions. And I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they criticism cost me ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day. This vindictive, forgetful fucking rain. It feels like we're on the road to hell.